Hi, I'm Matt Young and I'm here with Pint of Science Nottingham. Today joining me we've got Khalil Thirlway. He is a PhD researcher in immunology, and today we're just going to be talking to him about science and why he got into it. So, jumping straight in, how did you become interested in science? Like thinking back to when you were a young kid, little Khalil, about yay high, what was it that, was there anything at the time that got you interested?
I think it was ants. If I think back to my earliest memory of wondering like what was going on with something, I think it was watching ants going around and being like, where do they go? Like, how do they talk to each other? Like, because they wander around and they follow trails and they pick up food. And I remember as a kid, I would just, like in the summer, I'd just sit and watch the ants and follow them around and try and follow them back to their nest, but then I'd always lose them somewhere.
So it was it's a sense of like childhood curiosity, you think, that got you going?
Yeah, and I think that's what gets a lot of people into science is there's that stereotype that scientists are really just children who didn't grow up. That a lot of people when they grow up they lose that curiosity. But I think as nerds we gained even more curiosity. We're like, oh, I want to not only follow the ants to their nest, but I want to go inside the nest and see what their social structure is like and what chemical messengers they use. And as we get more into our scientific career, we get to answer those cooler questions.
Excellent. Yeah, that's. I think it's a really good way of putting it. That we're the nerds who don't really lose our curiosity, but arguably not many people do. They just don't apply it. But when you were, say, like coming towards like the end of school and you were going to go to university, what made you decide, yes, I'm going to go do science, a science subject? Did you always want to go into one particular field, or was it more of was there something else that swayed you towards it?
Well, within science, I was always definitely a biologist. I was good at and I enjoyed the questions in physics and chemistry and finding out kind of what light was and how molecules stayed together and stuff. But what really fascinated me was life, because if you look around us, we think we're so great inventing cars and computers and light bulbs, but we still haven't invented stuff that is as complex as, for example, the chemical processing in the metabolism of an animal, or the data processing in a mammalian brain or something. So it just felt like I wanted to see how nature had managed to do it so much better than us.
Okay, so did you have any role models as such in science? Is there any people who you identified when you were younger as being involved in sciences that inspired you to go further into it, or was there not really anyone in pop culture that you were aware of?
I mean, I grew up in Britain, so Attenborough was a big part of my childhood. It still is a big part of my life. But then, in terms of actual research, I think when I was young, I didn't really know that much about the world of research. Arguably, I still don't. And so, I think that I was mainly drawn towards the science. And then I went into research as a means to get deeper into science. When I was a small kid, I didn't really have any kind of reference of researchers.
Did you have any sort of preconceptions or ideas of what a scientist was like, or what work as a scientist would be like as a kid?
I thought it would be a lot easier than it is.
Did you think it would be all sort of white lab coats pouring different coloured chemicals into different things all day, or was it a little bit more complex than that?
At various stages of my life, I guess I've had different preconceptions of what a scientist's life is like. I think as a kid it was definitely that, or it was sticking a squid in a maze and giving it a prod and seeing what it would do. But then even before starting my PhD, I think that I thought that the life was going to be more kind of musing big questions and doing experiments about those big questions, rather than the actual day-to-day grind of being a scientist is dealing with the minutiae and taking tiny little baby steps. And sometimes you have to get used to the kind of scaling your expectations back from oh, I'm going to change the world in a year, to being like, okay, no, I'm going to incrementally find out little layers of information and build those eventually into what might be a big story. So I think patience is something that I had to learn.
Patience. So you're saying it's more about the little steps on the way. It's about the smaller discoveries that will build towards the bigger picture. So you kind of have to get
because what you learn about is the big things, like the theory of evolution, or Boyle's law, or you learn about the big ideas early on in your science education. And so you think, okay, when I'm a scientist, I'm going to come up with a law and call it Thirlway's law. But what you don't actually get a sense of when you learn about science is the years and years and decades, in many cases, of hard graft that go into these big ideas.
Thinking about your journey so far into becoming a scientist, now in your final year of your PhD, did you have any unexpected things that you learnt along the way, or any sort of key defining moments for you in your scientific career so far that's really stand out for you?
Defining moments. Yeah, I think an early defining moment in my scientific career was watching Alien, because that really is what made me properly fall in love with parasites. So I'm an immunologist by trade, but by love I'm a parasitologist, and I really like, especially within immunology, how parasites and the immune system interact. But yeah, I think watching Alien, because it had that complex life cycle with all the different stages, and it had the egg and the larva and inside the host. So that was an initial, it sounds weird, but it's an initial pivotal moment. Another was in undergrad. I had a really good supervisor for my literature project called Mark Viney, and he was a parasitologist. But he really helped me kind of on my road towards a PhD. Within my PhD, I would say that, probably about halfway through my PhD, when I started getting really scared that, I hadn't achieved, half of a PhD's worth of work. But actually, when I thought about it, you realise that the PhD is a training process. You're learning to be a scientist. And so you're not expected to just instantly be amazing as soon as you start. So there's kind of an exponential return when it comes to your growth as a scientist. So you start off pootling along, learning, but still kind of not great. Then there comes a tipping point where you suddenly realise, actually, no, I can do this. My experiments have started to work more than they don't work. And when I try new things, I have the reference points and the mental equipment to make them work. So that was a very important moment, when I went from being rubbish to being very quickly kind of competent. I'm not going to say I'm good, but going from rubbish to competent really was a turning point.
So realising yourself and actually I have learned something, and then realising you were actually putting it into practice pretty well enough to get something out of it.
Yeah, it's like that bit in The Matrix where Neo wakes up and goes, I know Kung Fu. I know immunology.
So, kind of on the sort of note of the journey, first part of the question, looking back at yourself like 5 years ago, if you had 30 seconds to give yourself like a little bit of advice, what would that advice be to 5 years ago, Khalil?
It's a long, long game, research. So, A, don't be too stressed out and disappointed in yourself if it doesn't all come together instantly. And B, that doesn't mean you can slack off from the beginning. You do need to put the work in at the beginning to enable your work to work at the end.
Yeah, and then 5 years in the future now, where would you like to see yourself, or where would you think you're going?
I love science. I am not in love with the job of research. And I think that I could contribute to science outside of that. So I think in, for example, science communication, there's a real drive to basically educate the general public about science, which is what Pint of Science is part of. But also, I've done a bit of work with radio and writing. Because, no matter how high our big ivory tower of science climbs, if the general public don't understand it, then it's almost worthless. Because, if people don't understand transgenic organisms, or stem cell research, or, climate change, then the policy makers are going to base their decisions on a low level of understanding. So when it comes to the people in power, and also the people who vote them there, then I think that it's very important for the general public to be at the baseline level of science to kind of rise.
So you're saying the pursuit of knowledge really is almost not worth it if that knowledge is not being shared and shared properly.
Yeah, what's the point in knowing something if only you know it?
Very, very, very good point there. Gives us a lot to consider. So what I want to ask you next was that if you weren't a scientist now, so say, given your current, your interests and everything, if you couldn't be a scientist, what other job would you be doing? Or do you think you would have gone into?
If we're going probability-wise, I probably wohave ended up a saxophonist. Because I play the saxophone, and at school, my teacher was, I don't want to blow my own sax, but I was pretty good. And my teacher was trying to persuade me to kind of get really more serious about it. And I didn't. And I concentrated on my science instead. So I think if I hadn't concentrated on science, there's a strong chance I would have ended up a jazz saxophonist, which would have been fun.
That's quite interesting because you have something in common with a lot of scientists there, is that a lot of scientists have also been in the past or are currently musicians as well. Popular example being Brian Cox, who before he became a scientist actually used to be a part of a pretty big band. So yeah, that's really interesting. Well, thanks very much for talking to us today, Khalil. If anyone else is interested in hearing more about Khalil and his research into immunology, you can catch him speaking for the Planet Earth event that will be running the 23rd to 25th of May at Rough Trade in Nottingham. So yeah, look out for us then.